Okay, this has come up recently as something that a few people wanted to do, and we were struggling to find a video which was clearly explaining how to do it online. There were a few bits and pieces scattered around, but nothing which seemed to clearly and cleanly explain how to do what we're wanting to do, which is effectively with one keyboard input device, be able to control two players independently. So we managed to find the information online and put together a quick demo to show how it works, and I'm going to talk you through that now. So just to show you what we've got with regards to this particular scene, so I'll just play for you, drag into here. So we've got the two players. These are just our cubes here that spawned into the world, and I can use WASD to move around the player on the left, and the left mouse button to fire, and the space button to jump. And then if I use the arrow keys, I'm able to move the other player around, right control to jump, and the 0 button on the other side should fire our projectiles. Okay, so how was that working? Well, the main bit of the code actually ends up in the player controller. So I've got everything that we need up at the top. We'll start with the player controller. So what it was requiring is you just to get the other player into the world was simply from the event begin play, create the local player, make sure we are spawning a player controller. You can leave the controller ID set to -1, which is what it is by default, but there's nothing else that's required. Now, of course, that's under the assumption that player 1 is already being spawned, so in your world settings that you've got your game mode and everything set up as it needs to be, that you are creating your custom player character. So we'll just go back over to the blueprints. So we've got our player. I experimented with a separate player character. We definitely don't need that. We only need that single player character blueprint in the scene. So we've got our BP our player here. That's set as the default pawn class, and then all of those are set as we set them up before. As you see, the player controller class is set to BP our controller. So everything's set up for the world settings and the game mode as it would be for one player. There's no changes there at all. Just quickly draw your attention to project settings as well. The only thing which we've made sure is in place is that on local multiplayer we have skip assigning gamepad to player 1. Make sure that checkbox is checked, and then we don't need that. That's all taken care of. But yeah, to just get the player 2 spawning into the world as we need to, we just need that create local player. What I've also got, of course, is two separate start points. So I've got, if I just go back to the outline, I've got my BP start for level 1 and 2. I've got two of those little player starts dropped into the world. And that's it. That gets them into the world. That's all we need. If I just quickly draw your attention to the player character blueprint as well, what you might notice if you've been following through the tutorials is that there is no player input here at all anymore. So the jump function, the move, all of that has disappeared. The mapping element is still there. So the bit where we have created our input mapping context, called from that single player controller, and then mapped it to our input mapping context. That's all stayed the same. That stays in the player character blueprint. So there's nothing that we've changed there, but you might notice we've taken away all of the inputs. So the jumping, the movement, and the firing, that's all gone. And that has gone into our BP player controller. So if I was here in the main window, if I double clicked on BPR controller, you might find that it doesn't give you the full window at first. It just gives you those core class settings, but there should be an option to open up in full blueprint. Once you do that, that will almost certainly be empty. But now what you can see I've done here is effectively is copy and paste all of the code from the movement that was originally in the player character into here, and then do a little bit of work to just effectively separate which player character is controlled is controlled by which input mapping. Now, to explain that just step by step, the first thing I needed to do was to adjust the input mapping context. So if I go to my input folder, that's where I've kept all of my different inputs and my input mapping. So what you will notice is that, and again in previous tutorials we will have gone over how to set up the move and the jump and the fire, but you'll notice there's a duplicate of everything. There is nothing different between the two. So input action fire is digital bool, it's got the press trigger on it, consume input, so you can see all of those settings there. If I go back to input fire 2, it's just a straight duplicate. There is nothing different between the two. So all I've done is simply just copy the fire, the jump, and the move, and the extra work basically is here, is in the input mapping context. So now what you'll notice is that I still have what we had originally put together, which was the input action jump, the move, the fire. But now again, I've duplicated them all. So we've now got an input action jump 2, move 2, and fire 2. And of course, these are all for your second player. Everything else is set up exactly the same. So if we compare the jump, the triggers or the modifiers, if there are any, obviously there aren't here, but you will see them on the move inputs, but they're duplicates. The only difference is, of course, they're mapped to different buttons. So whereas input action jump is mapped to the space bar for player 1, for jump 2 for player 2 is mapped to the right control button. So all you're going to be doing is copying all of the jumps, the moves, the fire inputs. So just create new mappings here for all three of those things. Copy them exactly as they are. So again, if we go to say move, where there's a lot more stuff going on, you've got the WASD. It's all, but that's just replaced for up, left, down, and right. But if we say go to the W, you can see we've got a modifier on place here, which is this swizzle input axis. If I go and compare it to the up, again, one input modifier, swizzle input axis. So they're completely duplicated. The only difference is, of course, the buttons which you're pressing. Once that's in place, we go back to our player controller, and you can see that all of the code that we'd taken from the player character, which just moved our single player around, is still here. So we've got an input action jump, and it's connected to that function jump, but we can't get that directly from the player controller. It needs to come from the player character. So because we've brought that in, we need to connect the target up to our player character, and you'll see, of course, that the index for our player character is 0, of course referring to the very first player character which was spawned into the world, player 1. So if we then compare that to player 2, exactly the same thing, but of course now rather than using our input action jump, we're using our input action jump 2 that we created, and the target has now changed to player character index 1, of course referring to player 2. And essentially it's that same principle all the way across. So with those two in place, I'd recommend doing that first and then testing that, and you should find that when you play test it and you press spacebar, player 1 will jump. When you press right control, player 2 will jump. If that's working, you're definitely on the right track, and then you can continue on with the rest. So here we've got how our move function works. We've got the input, the action value axis is coming out here. It's getting the control rotation from the player controller, which is this blueprint here. So you notice there's nothing new that needs plugging in here, but we do need to plug in the player character into the add movement inputs here and here. And of course, for player 1, obviously everything in this line is player 1. That's got player index of 0. Everything in this line is player 2. It's got player index of 1. So we're just plugging that one into the movement input. Previously, when they were in the BP hour player, they were just targeted to self. There was nothing plugged into them. So you do need to make sure once you've copy and pasted everything over, these will be empty. Of course, they'll just say self. That won't work. Make sure you're hooking in the player character to these add movement functions, and exactly the same here, but of course we're just making sure that that's player character index 1, that's player character index 0. And then finally, exactly the same thing, we've copy and pasted all of the input action fire. Again, all of this is the same, but in this instance we've had to make a few little changes, because what we couldn't do, if you remember how the actual fire works, it's spawning our little projectile from the location of the launcher, which is a component of our player character that we created. So it's a custom component. That can't just be dragged out from the player character. We do need to do a cast to, but if you set this up as you can see it here, so we're just dragging out from the input action fire. Again, the same principle. We do need to get the player character, but you need to cast to the BP hour player, the reference to our actual player character at this point. From there, you'll be able to access the launcher and then plug that into the get world rotation. Again, this bit will have been copy pasted in, and everything across here will be copy pasted. There's no other changes we need to make there. Just take the code away out of the BP hour player, and that will hook in perfectly well, but you will need to do the cast too. So you can see that's connected up to player character index 0. That one is, of course, connected up to player character index 1. And again, you've got fire 2 on the enhanced input action, whereas that is just fire. Exactly the same. Just going back, that's move 2. And then when you've got all of those in place, again, presuming that these two worked and you could independently jump around, if these are all correctly inputted, as shown here, then you will be able to test and see that they're now moving independently. So if we just compile and go back to that, so you'll know everything is working well if your player 1 is able to up, down, left and right and fire, and now separately I can move the other one around, up, down, left, right on the key, on the arrow keys rather than WASD. Control to jump, and 0 to fire. And that's everything. Okay, thanks very much for watching.